Before we get started, I just want to let everybody know that this session is going to be recorded, and if you have any questions throughout this presentation, please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A function to ask your question. But I also want to introduce Dave here. We're so excited to explore the vital link between soil health and the food that we eat and how it kind of impacts our well-being. Our speaker, Professor David Montgomery, is a professor at the College of Environment and a MacArthur Fellow and an award-winning author whose work in regenerative agriculture has reshaped how we think about farming and its effects on human health. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dave. Please take it away.
Well, Sebastian, thank you. And if I could ask everybody to mute their microphones, that will make it a little less distracting for me as we go through. But I'm happy to talk to you over a lunch hour here at UW. I'm going to share with you the essence of the latest book that I've written with my wife and co-author Anne Baclay, What Your Food Ate. But to do that, I'm going to basically try and run through the suite of the 4 books that you see up on the screen now, because they really define a theme that works together in terms of how uh, humanity's relationship with the land. I'm a geologist by training. I'm in the Earth and Space Sciences department, but I've done a lot of work on the relationship between ecological systems and geological or physical geography type systems, and the relation between people and the soil is what I really want to talk about today. So what I basically have done with this series of books that started back in 2007 with Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations, the book that I think probably is why I got the MacArthur. It laid out the problem of how societies in the past have treated the land and how that's affected their descendants, much to their detriment in terms of land degradation. After that, Anne and I wrote The Hidden Half of Nature together. It had insights into how the microbial world, the world of microbiomes in both around the roots of plants and in our own gut actually influences the health of host organisms in ways that should make us think fairly differently about both agriculture and medicine. And then I then took some time to travel the world and interview farmers for writing Growing a Revolution to try and look at how we could use the science from the hidden that we wrote about in The Hidden Half of Nature to help solve the problem that I wrote about in Dirt. And that's the book that really focused on regenerative agriculture and what it is, how it's done, and the promise that it has for reshaping our relationship with the land. The most recent book, What Your Food Ate, that Anne and I wrote and put out during the pandemic, was kind of our pandemic project. Uh, Basically looks at the question of how the health of the soil translates into human health, the relationship between human health and the health of the land. So let me get right into it. I'm going to try and breeze through the highlights of these 4 books. I'm sure the bookstore has them all. I've given copies to the library here if people want to check them out from the library here. But in any case, this first book, Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations, the key points from it are that societies that don't take care of their soil don't tend to last. That's one of the big underappreciated lessons of history that you can get by looking back at the archaeology and geology of different societies around the world in the post-glacial world in which agriculture developed. And soil erosion and degradation have limited the lifespan of past societies. That's not to say that erosion destroyed society after society, but it undercut their ability to thrive and contributed to their degradation in ways that limited how long that they were able to be around. And the problem of soil erosion is not just ancient history. This map shows you the UN's global map of soil degradation from a few years ago. And you'll notice that there's a lot of red on the map, areas that have what's described as very degraded soil. There's also a lot of orange, that's somewhat degraded soil. The point of showing you this map is simply to make the case that soil degradation is a global phenomenon. It is happening all around the world in places where people farm, in the most part, and other places as well, but I would put the most credence in those red points on the map. But you can go into each one of those red zones and find farms that are building healthy, fertile soils at a pace that a geologist like me finds incredibly fast. So there's both the seeds of pessimism here in this global pattern, but you can dig into it and find examples of people who are turning the story around. That's part of the story that I tell in these books. But if we look at the state of the soil today, the UN's Global State of the Soil Assessment from back in 2015 reported that humanity loses another 0.3% of our global food production capacity each and every year to ongoing soil erosion and degradation. That 0.3% doesn't sound like a big loss in any particular year, but if you keep doing that year after year, it can really add up. And if you play it out over the balance of this century, the next 100 years, it suggests that we're on track to degrade our ability to feed people on this planet by about 30% over the course of this century, when our population is projected to rise by about 50%. That suggests that, Houston, we might have a problem coming down the road. And this is one of the reasons that I looked back through history at what had happened to societies in the past in terms of their relationship with the land. And what has really caused a lot of soil degradation around the world is the invention of the plow. I mean, that fundamental implement that people use and think about when we think about what do farmers do? Well, they plow. And this image here on the bottom is not a bunch of space aliens following llamas around. It's actually an image from ancient Mesopotamia, the first image we have of plowing from about 4,000 years ago. And what has happened in terms of how that's affected the health of the land, well, think about what a plow does. It turns the soil over, and it leaves the soil bare and vulnerable to erosion by water or by wind until something new grows in the place of what you plowed over. And that could be a weed, it could be a forest, it could be a crop. But in the meantime, if it rains, you're going to be bleeding soil off the landscape. And how fast does that happen? Well, I've actually studied that. One of the things I did back in 2007 in writing the Dirt Book was to look at compiling rates at which modern farms are eroding all over the world. And I came up with a number that's published in the Proceedings of the National Academy that documented that modern agriculture, in a global average sense, erodes about 1 inch of soil in 20 years. That's about 1 millimeter a year. Your fingernails grow faster than that. Only a geologist would think that that was a really fast rate. But it is when you compare it to the pace at which nature builds soil. It takes nature centuries, 500 to 1,000 years, according to the USDA, a number that actually is pretty well backed up by research, to make that inch of soil that modern agriculture can shed in just a couple decades. The mismatch between those numbers is one of the big reasons that a geologist like myself would be concerned about what that does, not only to the landscape, but to human societies if it plays out over a long period of time. And in the Dirt Book, I go through the societies around the world that have experienced erosion problems in the past, and I'll just share one of those with you today. It's the American Southeast, the Piedmont region, from North Carolina down to Georgia. It's actually part of the hill country that received some of the worst damage from the hurricanes that were tragically just there. But this shows you the long-term loss of soil from the region that was compiled by USGS scientists back in the 1980s, where this gray noodle is the Piedmont, or the hill country, the upland. So it's not the coastal plain, it's not the rocky spine of the Appalachians, it's the hill country in between, which is one of the big breadbaskets of the early North American colonies. And you'll notice that 4 to 10 inches of topsoil have been stripped off this area in the last couple hundred years since colonial agriculture started. Some places have lost more than 10 inches of soil. How big a deal is that? Well, if you go back and you read the original journals from many of the early plantation owners and farmers in the 17th and 18th centuries, they reported they had about 6 to 12 inches of rich black earth over the subsoil. In other words, we've eroded off almost the entire topsoil off of a region that was a breadbasket of the early American colonies in just a couple centuries. Imagine what the Greeks or the Romans could have done with a 1,000-year run at their upland landscapes. It starts to put into perspective the idea that topsoil erosion can actually impact human societies over time scales that may be longer than our individual lives, but they're very relevant for maintaining our collective societies. And the loss of topsoil is not just the only issue in terms of soil degradation, it's also the loss of soil organic matter and soil fertility. This shows you two soils from in the middle of that gray noodle in the southeast that I showed you a moment ago. The one on the right-hand side of the screen, the khaki-colored one, is from a tobacco plantation that's been conventionally managed for the last 100 years. The one on the left, the darker one, the one that looks more so like, a dark chocolate kind of a cake, is the topsoil from a farm that was abandoned in the 19th century when its soil was degraded, but that was let to go back to forest. And you'll notice there's a big difference in these two soils where the rocks underneath are the same, the geological setting's the same, the climate is the same. The only difference is how they've been treated by people for the last 100 years. I have yet to meet a farmer who would rather be farming this essentially lifeless khaki pile of sand on the right than this rich, fertile ground on the left. And this story is not unique to those farms in the American Southeast. There was a paper that came out in the journal Sustainability back in 2015 that reported on the state of North American soils and the degradation that's happened historically. And their conclusion was that the soil organic matter content, and that translates into soil carbon, of many soils in North America is only about 50% of the level present at the time they were converted from forests or prairies to farmlands. In other words, we've burned through about half the organic matter in our farmland averaged across North America. And if you look at global estimates of how much soil organic matter has been lost to agriculture since the glacial age and most recently in the era of modern agriculture, that 50% loss of organic matter is a pretty robust number. In other words, we've drawn down the fertility batteries of our soils, the soils that feed us, by roughly half with centuries of farming. What is it about modern farming that actually contributes to the loss of soil fertility and soil organic matter? Well, as I reviewed in these books, there's really two things that scientific evidence and studies really backs up having a major impact on both soil erosion in the first place in terms of heavy routine tillage, and then also in terms of soil organic matter. This shows you a farm in Northern California that you can imagine what would happen if it rained on that site with that freshly plowed field. You'd have brown water running off, carrying the topsoil away with it. And heavy routine tillage and the overuse of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, which stimulate bacterial life that degrades soil organic matter faster than crops can sort of harvest the benefit, are the two causes really of long-term soil degradation, both in the ancient world in terms of the reliance on tillage, and especially at an accelerated pace in the modern world with our reliance on the combination of heavy routine tillage and the overuse of synthetic fertilizers. And that really concludes the depressing part of this talk, because when I finished writing the Dirt book, I was very interested in the question of, can we reverse the historical pattern of soil erosion and degradation? And if so, how fast could we do it? Is it something that would take us, 1,000 years to rebuild healthy, fertile soils, or could we do it much faster? And I'm delighted to report that I think we can do it screamingly fast. But to do that, we have to change how we farm. And how I learned to adopt that perspective really came in researching and writing The Hidden Half of Nature with Anne Beclay, my wife, who's a biologist and a very good writer and researcher. We put together the story of what happened in our yard in North Seattle as I was finishing up writing the Dirt book. I realized that her gardening efforts, her regenerative gardening efforts, were restoring fertility to the land that we bought in around Green Lake. I'll show you in a minute. But the basic points of The Hidden Half of Nature are that symbiotic microbial allies support the health of plants and animals, including people. This is the world of microbiomes that we've all started to hear a lot about in the last few years, especially around the human gut and the connections between your gut bacteria and depression and things like that. Well, there's similar relationships that happen in the soil between plants and soil life. And soil life acts similarly to our gut microbiome to help support the growth of plants and the health of crops. And the essential reality is that if we treat our bodies right with what we eat, and if we treat our soil right with how we farm it, we can enlist the help of trillions of tiny helpers that work for us for free and can help us reduce adverse health impacts to both the planet and ourselves. And I started realizing this in a big way when we bought this house in Green Lake that came with a yard that had a side yard that my biologist wife, as a gardener, really wanted to turn into a garden. But when we stripped off the soil that the house came with, we realized that we had crap soil. This looks like that Virginia tobacco plantation. We had, for those of you gardeners in Seattle, we had basically a highly compacted glacial till. It was not what we wanted to find as gardeners, and I'll leave to your imagination why a geologist and a biologist didn't dig a soil pit in the house that they were thinking about buying, but we kind of regretted it when we pulled the ratty lawn off to start planting the yard that we really wanted. And realized that we had the geological part of healthy soil. We had all the mineral matter we needed, courtesy of the glacial age reshaping of Seattle. What we were lacking was organic matter and biology. Not a single worm crawled out of that soil when we pulled that lawn off. So Anne embarked on what she called her organic matter crusade. That was essentially a effort to bring in organic matter from wherever she could get it. She brought in the wood chips from arborists, We started composting our food scraps. She got zoo doo from the Seattle Zoo. We collected coffee grounds from behind neighborhood coffee shops. We brought all kinds of organic matter back to the yard to try and enhance our soil. And I was amazed at how fast it actually worked. This shows you the soil that we started with in my right hand on the left hand side of the screen. The wood chips are the stuff that we added, but look at the color of the soil. It's khaki like that North Carolina tobacco plantation. The soil that we had as of a few years ago is this more rich, dark, carbon-rich, really healthy, fertile soil. We increased the carbon content of our soil across our yard by almost 1% per year for a decade, taking it from 1 or 2% up to pushing 10%, transforming it from virtually sterile into incredibly fertile, and the explosion of life above ground in the garden eventually gave Anne the garden she always desired and that I thoroughly enjoyed in the summers. But the point being that we could actually restore soil really fast, and we started to wonder what was behind this transformation. What was really happening to all that organic matter that we were putting on the soil? We were aware that it was feeding life, but we weren't really aware of the complex symbiotic relationships that were going on in the soil beneath our feet that really boil down to this word exudates. And exudates are things that plants drip out of their roots. We all know how plants pull carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in through their leaves, mixed with water they pull up through their roots to create the carbohydrate backbones of the botanical world. But there's all this activity in the zone called the rhizosphere. And rhizo is Greek for roots, sphere is an area, so the zone around the roots of a plant. And it turns out that roots are not just straws for taking in the water and nutrients that plants get from the soil, but they're two-way superhighways, because those exudates are things that plants drip out of their roots. And the image on the right shows you a plant dripping a drop of exudate into the soil. And there's plenty of research now that documents that many plants and many crops will exude out of their roots anywhere from a quarter to up to sometimes even more than half of the material that they fix through photosynthesis. They'll drip it out of their roots. Now, why would they do that? They're not doing it to be lazy or inefficient. Nature's brutally inefficient in many ways. They're doing it to feed microbes around their roots, because there's what Anne and I term a biological bazaar in the rhizosphere that is rooted in symbiotic or mutually beneficial relationships between the life in the soil and the life of the plants. So if we blow up the zone around a root of a plant, so you got this little plant root coming down through here, the plants are releasing exudates into the soil, and those exudates don't make it very far. They get consumed anywhere from a millimeter to a centimeter away from those roots. And what's eating them? Well, bacteria and fungi in the soil. If you want to find a really life-dense part of the world, look around the roots of a healthy plant in a healthy, fertile soil. Those exudates are feeding a tribe of bacteria and fungi in the soil that eat them. And then what does anything do with something that they eat? They metabolize it. And when Anne and I started finding research papers that documented that microbes in the soil, bacteria commonly, were metabolizing exudates that plants released into the soil and making from those exudates metabolites that were things like plant growth promoting hormones, the light bulbs really went off in our heads, thinking that, oh, yeah, the plants are feeding beneficial life forms in the soil because they get something in return. They've essentially outsourced some biogeochemical processing to make things like growth hormones to promote the growth of plants, and so that the plants can grow bigger, put up bigger solar panels, collect more carbon and build more carbohydrates, put out more exudates, feed more microbes. It's a positive feedback, a virtuous cycle. Fungi in the soil will actually also extend their little root-like hyphae into plants, and then off into the soil, where they'll mine and prospect things like phosphorus or mineral elements, things like copper and zinc that we need in the soil, plants need to get from the soil, but that aren't all that common in the soil. And they will trade those to plants for a cut of those sugary exudates. Because what are those exudates made out of? Things like carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. What does that sound like? It sounds like food. Plants are basically releasing a cocktail of food into the soil to attract and recruit microbial allies that do things that benefit the health of the plants. And this leads us to thinking, there's two ways that we can think about the potential diet that a plant may have that relates to how we how we in turn feed the soil. So we all know that there's if you take a plant that is growing in fairly poor soil and you give enough nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium, the NPK from a fertilizer bag, you can grow a lot of biomass. Whether the plants are healthy may be another question, but you can grow a lot of biomass in fairly degraded soils, and that's been the tact that a modern conventional agriculture has pursued now for close to a century. And by doing that, plants tend to get a little lazy. If they're getting the things they need for most growth, and that's what N, P, and K are, those are the key elements for spurring plant growth, the plants will typically invest less in their root systems. And I've done this experiment many times on cornfields across the United States. You go to a conventional field and you can sort of pull up the corn plants by the roots because they haven't invested much in their root system. You go to a really rich, organic matter rich, healthy soil, on the other hand, and the plants will invest much more in their root system and much more in the exudates they put out. So in a degraded soil with plants not investing much in their roots, they don't make much in the way of exudates. That means the plants are not getting much in the way of mineral micronutrients from their microbial partners, and they're not getting those beneficial microbial metabolites that help set up plant defense systems, communication systems. Whereas in a plant's growing in healthy, fertile soil, organic matter rich soil, those dark soils that I was showing you, you don't need to add as much, if any, N, P, and K to grow robust biomass. But the plants are also getting a higher component of mineral micronutrients. I'll share some data confirming this with you a little later in the talk. And they also get a much higher dose of beneficial microbial metabolites, things that then our body uses to metabolize that promote our health. So we can think of agriculture as promoting either a fertilizer diet or a soil health diet, and there are different ways to think about our relationship to the land. Why would we care about that? Those mineral micronutrients are a thing that soil life helps plants collect and gather from the soil, are things like iron. It's important for our health, zinc, selenium, copper. Copper turns out to be really important for maintaining the human immune system, but we can't eat pennies to get our copper. If you try it, it doesn't work. We need plants to eat the rocks that have the copper in it first, and then we can eat the plants or the animals that ate the plants to get that copper as it cascades through the system. So mineral micronutrients are things that soil life, and particularly in healthy, fertile soils, help plants take up. And there's also what are known as phytochemicals. And phytochemicals, it's a word, phyto is plant, chemical, so it's a plant-made chemical. And phytochemicals are things like the linalool in lavender that gives it its distinctive aroma. Sulforaphane in the brassicas, in broccoli and cauliflower and things. Sulforaphane helps plant defense and health, but it also has anti-cancer properties when we consume it in our diet. And curcumin, the active ingredient in turmeric, a element in classical Indian medicine, or a compound used in classical Indian medicine, is another compound that in our diet benefits our health. But these are chemicals that plants are making not for our benefit. Plants make phytochemicals because they help plants. And what do? Phytochemicals help with plant communication. Imagine how plants communicate with each other. They don't have a language like we know. They speak a chemical language, a biochemical language, and that's how they communicate with organisms in the soil, putting out certain phytochemicals to recruit certain organisms that will do things for them, things that are like plant defense, because there's some cases where when particular insects will chomp on a leaf of a plant and start grazing on its foliage, that plant will release a phytochemical into the soil that recruits a particular microbe to consume that phytochemical and make a metabolite that the plant can then take back up because it's right around the roots of the plant. And that metabolite makes the plant taste bad to that particular insect pest. This is the essence of plant defense. Plants can't get up and run away from a predator. They engage in chemical defenses, and the communication with soil life is one of the things that gives plants an access to a broader arsenal of compounds to employ in their defense, and for their protection as well. For example, the beta-carotene that gives carrots and squashes the orangish color. You'll also find beta-carotene on the back of sunscreen labels. Why? Because it's a great UV blocker. And so plants make phytochemicals for their own purposes, but those phytochemicals, when they get into us, and turn out to have beneficial benefits for human health as well, as I'll go into a little later. But so this biological bazaar in the soil, the life around the roots of a plant in a healthy, fertile soil that has lots of organic matter that helps to feed that soil life, that's really nature's health plan for soil and for crops. And so our farming practices affect the soil organic matter level, as well as soil erosion and just whether the soil stays on the land in ways that can undermine nature's health plan for soil and health plan for crops. This led, those kind of revelations led Ann and I to really sort of appreciate and dive into the microbial world. And there's whole parallels between what goes on between the plant's root microbiome and what goes on in the human gut. We write in The Hidden Half of Nature that those systems are just the same thing inside out in terms of the effects of those microbial actors on nutrient acquisition, on the human immune system or plant defense, on communication. There's lots of connections there and parallels. They're just the same system inside out. Plants have outsourced their digestion to the soil and outsourced their phytochemical production to the soil. In the human body, it all happens in our colon when our gut microbiome ferments many of the things that we eat. In any case, refer back to The Hidden Half of Nature if you want to go into the details of those parallels. They're actually pretty astounding. But one of the things I was left with after writing The Hidden Half of Nature with Anne was the question of, it's one thing to restore soil fertility on a small farm on a small urban lot, our side yard, where we've got access to things like Zoodoo and coffee and lots of coffee grounds and wood chips from people who are anxious to get rid of them. But what about restoring soil on farms around the world? What about actually reversing that problem of soil degradation that I wrote about in Dirt? Well, Growing a Revolution is the book that really researched what that is by visiting farmers around the world who had done to their farms what Anne did to our yard, who had restored fertility to their land in radically short order, faster than you would find described in textbooks about how fast soils are made. And I basically found that regenerative farming can restore soil fertility remarkably fast. What do I mean by remarkably fast? Well, within a decade or two, in decades, not centuries. To me, that's remarkably fast. And I found that farming and ranching could put a whole lot of carbon back in the ground. There's a lot of controversy over about just how much carbon agriculture can take out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis and park, at least temporarily, in the soil as soil organic matter. But the numbers pencil out as fairly large, even if there's large uncertainties about just how much can be done based on how much farmland there is in the world and how many people might actually adopt these regenerative practices. But the bottom line on how to actually enhance soil fertility and soil organic matter and restore soils boils down to ditch the plow, cover up, and grow diversity. And I'll get into what those actually mean in a moment. The big difference, of course, is that conventional agriculture that we've been favoring as a global society for the last century really emphasizes chemistry as the foundation for fertility. And chemistry is obviously critically important, as is physics. But the biology is really what was forgotten about in modern conventional farming, or I shouldn't say forgotten about. It was shortchanged in terms of how we think about the relationship between the soil and the crops and their health and their productivity. Regenerative agriculture emphasizes cultivating beneficial soil life, which is a biogeochemical process as opposed to an agrochemical process. What is it about the farmers I visited around the world who had successfully restored fertility to their land in amazingly short order? And I visited farmers in equatorial Africa, subsistence farmers in equatorial Africa and Central America. I visited large industrialized farms across North America, small no-till vegetable farms in areas in near urban environments in the United States. And what I basically found was that the farmers who had rebuilt their soil fertility really fast followed farming practices that used three basic principles of regenerative agriculture. They minimized disturbance of the soil, so they're minimizing both their physical disturbance through either minimizing or eliminating tillage, and they minimized their agrochemical use. So they're minimizing physical and chemical disturbance of the soil. So they're minimizing their disturbance of soil life. Imagine what a plow does to all the life in the soil when it turns it over. It disrupts everybody's home. It's not conducive to supporting that community of life. And these farmers also kept the soil always covered. So that meant they were always growing something in their soil. They didn't leave their soil bare and vulnerable to wind or rain. They kept it covered in between their cash crops with cover crops. And they also grew a diverse rotation of crops. They didn't just grow one or two things on the same piece of land over and over again. That's an invitation for pests and pathogens, which in turn invites um, the use of pesticides. So those three things, minimizing disturbance, keeping the soil covered, and diverse crop rotations, that essentially means ditch the plow, cover up, and grow diversity. And that worked. Those practices people use in different parts of the world were different. The subsistence farmers in equatorial Africa didn't have access to the technology that the farmers in, say, the Dakotas did. But they followed practices that engaged these basic principles, given their technological access and the crops they wanted to grow and the markets they could sell them into. Some also reintegrated animal husbandry into their farming operations in ways that accelerated the pace of soil building. And we're taught these days to think of animal agriculture as something that degrades the land and is bad for the environment. And the way it's practiced conventionally, that's true. But that doesn't mean that's how we have to do it in terms of how we raise animals for those of us who wish to eat meat and dairy. There's ways to do it that actually enhance the fertility of the land. And as I'll show in the last section of this talk, when I talk about what your food ate, that also enhance the nutritional value of the human diet. So those basic principles of regenerative agriculture seem to translate well to generalized settings, but the specific practices need to be tailored to the specific setting. You can't use the same practices on farms all around the world because their settings and context differ. But the principles behind which you map farming practices onto the farm actually seem to be fairly clear. The principles that support um, fostering communities of beneficial life in the soil, fostering soil microbiomes to rebuild soil health and fertility. There's a principled way to do it. And this shows you the results of what can happen on a full-scale farm. This is from David Brandt's farm in Carroll, Ohio, which when he started farming it back in 1971, his soil looked like this soil over here on the right, which is actually from his neighbor's farm that is a conventional farm, the one I visited back in 2015. The soil that David had on his farm, however, had been converted from this khaki stuff to this rich chocolate cake. How did he do it? Well, he went to no-till farming in the early 1970s and then started adopting cover crops in I believe, the 1980s, and then went to diversifying his cover crops in a big way in the 90s. And so he got the diversity in through growing a diverse set of cover crops, 10 to 12 different kinds of cover crops all at once in between his cash crops. What was he growing for sale? Wheat, corn, and soybeans. He was a North American commodity farmer, but he turned degraded land into super fertile land, and in so doing, he essentially eliminated the need for, he almost weaned himself off of nitrogen fertilizers and chemical and synthetic pesticides, and he stopped plowing. He stopped the chemical and physical disturbance of his land. The second example shows you the changes in the soil on Singing Frogs Farm, Paul and Elizabeth Kaiser's farm in Northern California in Sebastopol. The kind of soil they started with was over here on the right-hand side of the screen, and my left hand, the soil they had 10 years later is on the right. Notice the color difference. That color is all carbon, and carbon is the fuel that feeds the microbes in the soil that help drive all that nutrient cycling and phytochemical production and mineral acquisition that I talked about earlier. The Kaisers took their land from roughly 1%, 2%-ish organic matter, which is fairly degraded, up to pushing 10% over almost the course of the same time frame that Ann did it to our yard. And the Kaisers, of course, use similar kind of principles of they are a small no-till vegetable farm. They minimized disturbance. They kept the ground covered with living plants that they harvested, and they grew an incredible diversity of crops. The third guy that I'll show you the example for is Gabe Brown's farm in Bismarck, North Dakota. This shows you the field that he grows crops for his market garden, but I'm illustrating here is he's reintegrated animal husbandry into his regenerative farming operation. He brings cows in to graze off his cover crops and the remains of his vegetable cash crops, and he brings his chickens in to eat the things that then fly out of the cow pies that the cows are leaving. But in this case, what the cows are doing is they're essentially self-propelled digesters that are digesting that organic matter and turning it into compounds that go back into the soil and support soil health. They're an accelerant to rebuilding the soil, not a detriment. And it also provides additional income to Gabe because he's not only selling grains and vegetables, he's also selling eggs and meat. This is basically the difference that roughly a decade of farming that way did to Gabe's soil. His neighbor's soil is shown here in his left hand down below. The soil from that field that I just showed you is a hole that we dug literally right after taking that photograph. It's this rich black earth. Again, one of these is visibly far more fertile than the other, but Gabe has completely eliminated the use of synthetic fertilizers and synthetic pesticides. So he's essentially an organic farmer now who chooses not to describe himself as organic because that's not the tribe he belongs to, and he doesn't want to bother with the certification. What he has done, though, is restored incredible fertility to his land in really short order. And this graph that I borrowed from Gabe's TED Talk really illustrates what happened. When he started farming back in 1993, he went to no-till because there's a whole story behind that, and I encourage you to read his book if you want his life story. But he started out with about less than 2% organic matter and about 3 inches of topsoil across his ranch. Over time, he adopted diversity in his cash crops, and he started adding cover crops, started to see some modest increase in his organic matter content. He then went to multi-species cover crops and growing things year-round and reintroducing livestock. Over the course of that 20-year run, he took his 3 inches of topsoil, grew it to 14 inches, so he was growing soil down into the land. And he also took it from 2%, roughly 2% organic matter to roughly 6%. That's tripling the soil organic matter content. And when you think about the fact that there's twice as much organic matter in the world's soils as there is in the atmosphere, if we could basically triple soil organic matter content on farms around the world, it would take a big bite out of CO2 in the atmosphere. Again, people argue about just about how much of a difference that can make, but there's some pretty clear evidence in what I've seen that it could be a big influence, something we should be doing to rebuild the fertility of our land and harvest the climate benefit as a bonus. Well, what does this mean for the farmer, though? That's actually sort of a key thing in terms of the potential acceptance of these more regenerative farming methods. And Claire Lacan and Jonathan Lundgren published a paper a year after Growing Revolution came out, where they documented the effects of conventional and regenerative agriculture on the revenue and costs per hectare for, I think it was about 20 farms growing. For this example, they focused on corn because they were working in the corn belt, and that's what do you grow in the corn belt? A lot of corn. And they compared the total cost and return for the average conventional regenerative farm in their sample size. And the way that you read the graph is that their harvest tells you at the top how much money they harvested off per hectare off their land. So the regenerative farmers actually harvested more. They had a higher crop yield than the conventional farmers. And that's counter traditional narrative right there. These regenerative techniques can boost the productivity of farmland. But then you subtract off all these colored things that say how much they spent on corn seeds, crop insurance, how much they spent on fertilizer, for example. And you notice that the regenerative farms, which were not organic farms, these were just farms following these regenerative practices, they spent a lot less on fertilizer, they spent less on seeds, they spent far less on irrigation. In other words, they spent less, they were harvesting more and spending less, and that left them with the white bar at the bottom, which is the magnitude of their profit, which is about 2/3 again higher than their conventional neighbors. This is the kind of data that started, and I heard stories about this from all the farmers I visited in writing Growing Revolution, that one of the primary benefits of healthy soil was higher farmer profits. And that started turning me into an optimist in thinking that these practices could start to catch on among farmers around the world. Because if you're going to have a sustainable farm, you have to sustain the farm. It has to be profitable in whatever system you're operating in. And the ability to use less fertilizer, less pesticide, and less fossil fuel, and if you're not plowing, you're burning far less fossil fuel, while you still harvest comparable yields, that translates into higher farmer profits. You're spending less to make more. Even a geologist can tell you that that's a good business model. But what these regenerative practices also do is they put more carbon and water in the soil. They can retain more water in the soil that makes farms more drought resilient, and more carbon in the soil that can build fertility, but where's that carbon coming from? Out of the atmosphere, because it's captured through photosynthesis. And it also results in less offsite pollution. The single best way to reduce the offsite pollution from nitrates and phosphates, from nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers, is to use less of them in the first place. So these regenerative farming practices have a whole lot of benefits. But the one that I haven't talked about yet is the connection between soil health and human health. And that is the connection that Ann and I wrote about in What Your Food Ate. And in researching that book, we basically found that we wanted to ask the question of how do farming practices influence soil health, crop health, livestock health, and human health? These are suggested connections that have been kicking around since the 1940s, but there's now enough science, enough solid peer-reviewed science to document the mechanics of how those connections actually work. And we tried to do that in What Your Food Ate. And we basically, what we came away with from writing this book, that I'll share you some of the results from here in a minute, is that farming practices can affect dietary levels of phytochemicals in our food, vitamins and minerals, omega-3 and omega-6 fats, and microbial metabolites. These four things are all things that when you go into the biomedical literature, they promote human health. And if you go into the farming literature, you can show how farming practices affect how much of them ends up in our food. So we tried to research how big that effect was and why it mattered, what difference it was, and we couldn't actually find a study out there in the peer-reviewed science world that had compared the nutrient density or the composition of crops grown with these regenerative practices, that minimal disturbance, the cover crops, and diversity of crops, and compare that to conventionally grown produce from the same soil and the same climate right next door. So we did that study. We took 10 paired adjacent farms and had the same kind of soil, and it's across the country from over here in California to Connecticut, with a bunch in the Midwest and some in the Southeast. And we basically looked at farms that had been farmed regeneratively for between 5 and 10 years, and a neighboring conventional farm had them grow the same crops in the same year, literally kind of across the fence from one another. And what we basically found is that the soil organic matter content of the regenerative farms was higher than the conventional ones. The regenerative ones are in blue. The scale over here on the left goes from 2% up to 10% through there. And basically the regenerative farms had on average about twice as much carbon in their soil. In terms of a soil health score, the fairly well-known Haney soil health test, the regenerative farms had 3 times higher soil health scores. What's in the soil health score? Well, it combines both the amount of organic matter, so it's a little redundant with the graph on the left, but it also looks at microbial activity and microbial community activity. So you had more organic matter and more microbes in the soil. You had healthier, more fertile soil on the regenerative farms. What difference did it make to the foods? Well, we can look at average values of cabbage, corn, peas, sorghum, and soy. For phytochemicals up here in purple, carotenoids, phenolics, and phytosterols were all up about 20% higher in the regenerative farms. These are all things that have been shown to have positive effects on human health. In terms of vitamins, there's a number of vitamins that had anywhere from 15 to 30% higher levels in the regenerative crops. And again, vitamins, they're good for us, right? So in terms of minerals, they were kind of all over the map in this comparison, as you might expect, with samples from geologies all over the country. But the point being is we were able to find that there are actually these differences in farming practices translate into differences in the crops that we eat. We also then looked at another biological bazaar, the world of the rumen, when we look into how farming practices can impact meat and dairy and what's in them. And the basis for that is basically looking at what Ann and I call the fats of the land. And that's the amount of 2 very different fats in our diet, the omega-3 fats and the omega-6 fats. These are unsaturated fats that are essential fats. We need them for our metabolic processes, but we can only get them from our diet. Our bodies cannot make them. And the omega-3 fats are very rich in leafy greens. Why? Because omega-3s are involved in photosynthesis. So when we eat leafy greens, we're getting omega-3s, and when animals like cows eat leafy greens, they're getting a lot of omega-3s. Omega-6s, on the other hand, are much more stable molecule that is very rich in seeds and seed oils. And so an animal that has a diet that's has a lot of corn or wheat or seed derived or seed oil derived fats, they're going to be rich in omega-6s. What that means is that what our livestock eats translates into their fat balance. If we have livestock that is grazing on natural vegetation and leafy greens, they're going to have a high proportion of omega-3s in their diet. But if they are basically eating seed, corn and soy derived feeds in feedlots or seed oil derived feeds that are not involving leaves, they're going to basically having an overload of omega-6 fats. And if we look at what's happened to the human diet, or in the post Second World War world, our diet has gone from having roughly a balance of omega-3 and 6 fats to one where the omega-6 fats greatly outnumber the omega-3 fats in our diet, in great part because our meat and dairy are now dominantly eating corn and soy derived feeds, so they have their awash in omega-6s. Their omega-6 to 3 ratio in livestock has gone, and meat and dairy has gone up to 10, 20, or 30 to 1 omega-6s to omega-3s, whereas the ancestral human diet had a rough balance, a rough parity of either somewhere between 1 to 1 and 4 to 1 in terms of omega-6s to omega-3s. So our diet has changed. The diet of cows has changed. That's actually had a big effect on the health of livestock and the health of people too, I would argue. The other thing that's in our animal diets are phytochemicals. Phytochemicals that a cow eats, for example, get passed on in its meat and dairy. At some level, they get processed in the biological bazaar of the rumen, where the microbes in the cow can transform them. But those phytochemicals can serve as precursors to compounds that have medicinal effects in the human body. And there's a recent study by Stefan van Vliet and colleagues that looked at 22 studies of meat and milk that were where the cows were fed either a pastured diet, so lots of leafy greens, ought to be high in omega-3s, versus a concentrate diet, ought to be low in omega-3s. But this study actually looked at the concentration of different phytochemicals, carotenoids, tocopherols, vitamin E's, polyphenols, terpenoids. Those are things that act as anti-inflammatory and antioxidants in the human diet. They do the same thing for cows. And we go into the veterinary effects in What's Your Food Aid as well, but I'm going to focus on the human effects here. But basically, the upshot is in grass-fed meat and dairy, phytochemical levels are 2 to 20-fold higher than in conventionally raised meat and dairy. And the omega-3 to omega-6 ratios are totally different in 100% grass-fed meat and dairy and conventionally raised meat and dairy. Because that ruminant, what the cows are eating ripples up into the human diet. So if we have, whether we, for those of us who eat meat and milk, the way that the cow ate, what our food ate, actually has a huge impact on the fat balance and on the phytochemical content that ends up making it into the human diet. And why might this matter? Why is this, potentially sort of a big deal? Well, let's take a minute to look at what's happened to human health since the Second World War. So if we look at the incidence of infectious diseases, up until COVID times at least, the incidence of infectious diseases were pretty much on a downward trend. Why? Well, because of improved sanitation and because of vaccines. So, things like tuberculosis, there's a whole lot of diseases that plagued our great-grandparents that we know nothing about because we haven't seen them much lately. On the other hand, autoimmune disorders and chronic diseases have been going through the roof since the Second World War. They've all been increasing. Right around the time when there was a major change in the human diet, when we went to wholesale conventional agriculture with a lot of tillage and agrochemical use that undermined those symbiotic relationships in the soil that provided minerals and antioxidants and anti-inflammatories into the human diet. 7 out of 10 of us in the United States now suffer from some kind of chronic illness that the medical world argues is rooted in diet and inflammation, and those are connected. So what's the connection between inflammation and diet? Well, there's a number of connections between inflammation and diet, and I'm going to emphasize just one that relates to what I've been talking about so far. But if we look at inflammation as a process, you want inflammation to work in your body, right? If you cut your finger in the kitchen on a knife that you've been chopping your vegetables with, for example, you want your body to start to get inflamed at that spot and to have your immune system starting to attack whatever it is that was on that knife that's now in you. But once your immune system has it under control, you want inflammation to stop. And a large part of chronic inflammation related chronic illnesses are related to chronic inflammation, and the problem is that inflammation is not stopping. So if we look at inflammation as a process, and the magnitude of inflammation is on the y-axis, time is on the x-axis, there's an onset phase where certain fats act to help start and maintain inflammation. Other fats, on the other hand, act to end inflammation in the resolution phase. And you might not be surprised to hear that it's omega-6 fats that tend to fairly consistently be associated with the processes that initiate and trigger inflammation. And it's the omega-3 fats that are on the other end of things that are commonly associated with the processes of terminating inflammation. So if we take our diet, having taken our diet and shifted the omega-6 to 3 balance profoundly with food processing that routinely adds seed oils to almost everything that comes in a box, to changes in the omega-6 to 3 ratio in our meat and dairy products, our bodies are now awash in omega-6 fats, and we have a dearth of omega-3s. This relates to the ability of our bodies to initiate inflammation. It's pretty easy for our bodies to do that now. It's much harder for our bodies to terminate inflammation. We go into all the science behind all that in What Your Food Ate. It was a fascinating dive into it. And the last thing that I'll share with you before wrapping up here is that the phytochemicals that make it into the human diet also really matter to human health. And as we've seen, phytochemical sources and fruits and vegetables, farming practices influence the amount of phytochemicals that get into them. In terms of meat and dairy, what the cow is eating, whether they're eating, whether they're grazing on leafy green plants or eating seeds or seed-derived feeds, has a huge impact on whether or not, well, not only their omega-6 to 3 balance, but whether or not they get access to phytochemicals. Leafy greens tend to be rich in phytochemicals. Seeds do not tend to be. So what happens to all these phytochemicals in the foods that we eat? They go down the hatch into our digestive system where the human microbiome starts to work on them. Many of those phytochemicals are wrapped up, they come packaged in what your doctor calls fiber. That's organic matter that's hard for our body to break down, so it makes it through the stomach and lands in the colon, the bottom end of our digestive tract, where the human microbiome starts to ferment that organic matter and that fiber and the phytochemicals held within it. And this is another case of microbial metabolites, because the things that the human microbiome, a healthy human microbiome, converts those phytochemicals that passed along from the vegetation to livestock to us. Those microbial metabolites can have medicinal effects. There's studies that document anti-cancer effects, anti-diabetic effects, anti-inflammatory effects, positive effects on brain health and on heart health from the metabolites that the microbes are making from the phytochemicals that the cow ate, for example. This is why these kind of connections are how you can basically paint the connection between how we treat the land affects the health of the soil, the health of crops, the health of livestock, and ultimately the health of us. And so, looking into these kind of relationships over the course of the last 10 years as a geologist, I've been led to a fairly simple conclusion that has profound implications, I think, for both agriculture and medicine. What's good for the land is good for us too. We need to take better care of our soil so that our food can take better care of us. Now, I obviously recommend the books to you all. There's a lot more detail in here, but what I've tried to do today is to give you the overview and executive summary of what I've learned in researching these things over the course of the last decade. It's been a very interesting ride. It's been a lot of fun. One of the privileges of the job as a professor here at UW is the ability to research things that I think matter. And I think these issues have not received the attention that they deserve in terms of both our agricultural policies and our healthcare policies, because when you really think about it, through this lens. Our agricultural policy is health policy, and these two are connected. So I'm going to stop sharing there. I see that someone has their hand up with a possible question. I'm happy to stay on for a bit and answer questions if people have them. I know these books are both in the library, and the UW bookstore has them. Any bookstore can get them, and obviously I would recommend them to you. So anyway, I thank you all for your attention, and I hope you all get outside today to enjoy a little bit of what may be the last nice day before the curtain comes down. So thank you all, and Ava, if you have a question, go ahead and feel free to ask it.
Wow. Simply amazing, David. I feel like, as someone who cares a lot about what they eat, I'm sure most people in this room do. I found that your presentation simply enlightening. And yes, if there are any questions, please feel free to ask. We have a few minutes here. And I just also want to mention, Dave, thank you to your co-author and your wife for all the work that you do. That was simply just amazing to watch. You are an awesome storyteller as well.
Well, thank you. And there's no way I would have put this story together without having a wife who's a biologist. Because
Yeah,
it's like, in terms of thinking about soil, it's that interface between biology and geology. And I have a lot of training in geology, much less so in biology, although that is what I started out as.
yeah,
And so Ann and I have really worked as partners through this whole thing. I never would have figured it out on my own.
absolutely. Amazing teamwork. I did get a question that came through.
Oh, yeah, I haven't looked at the chat. I ignore that usually when I'm speaking.
Oh, no worries. I am also here happy to help field them as well. So someone asked if can would you be able to confirm which book would be most useful for gardeners in terms of understanding types of soil enhancements or just ways that they can help improve their own soil?
Yeah, in terms of for home gardeners, I would recommend The Hidden Half of Nature. It tells the story of what Anne did in the yard. So you get a first person account of just what she did to restore the soil in our yard. If you're most interested in global food systems and farming stuff and soil carbon, I'd recommend Growing Revolution. The What's Your Food Date book is the one that puts it all together. So, it's the fourth book out of that series, and it really is rooted in what we learned in writing the other three. So if you want sort of the summary of the whole deal, I would start with What Your Food Ate, and then if you're really interested in the history, read Dirt. If you're really interested in microbes, read The Hidden Half of Nature, and if you're really interested in farming systems, read Growing Revolution. But I would start with I would definitely suggest starting with What Your Food Ate.
Understood. Thank you. Looks like we got two questions here as well. Some Dan asked, do we know how much relative health impacts of diet can be ascribed to oil, plant, or soil, plant, animal production versus food processing?
That's a great question, and I'm not really sure. What I am certain of is that you can, in each of those worlds, you can basically try and minimize the effect on you by looking at what's in the box on the food processing end of things. And the short answer there is you don't want to eat a lot of, you want to minimize the eating of seed oils to the degree that you can. And in terms of the human health effects on soil going into the diet, there has not been a lot of work on it. There's not a lot of studies you can lean on. We gathered everything we could find into What Your Food Ate, and the reference list for that book is, I think, it's about 1,000 peer-reviewed papers long. And if you look on our website, digtogrow.com, you can download a copy of that reference list. We didn't put it in the final book because the publisher complained about the 80 pages of references at the back of the book. But there's a lot of science that goes into it, but there hasn't been a lot that has explicitly tried to connect soil health to human health. Why? There's a lot of steps in between. So in the book, we try and take it one step at a time, like beads on a string, to go, can you get from one end to the other with peer-reviewed studies? And we found that you can, but what you can't really do is run like a large-scale experiment on a population today, because you walk into a grocery store and where's that food coming from? It's all over the world. And we're all eating an incredible variety of things, and we know that our genetics matters a lot to our health, and our lifestyle matters a lot to health. There's so many confounding factors that it's very difficult to go straight from soil health to human health, which is why we took the tact in What Your Food Ate of breaking it down into how does farming affect soil health? How does soil health affect what gets into our crops and crop health? How does what we feed our livestock affect livestock health, and then how you integrate that all up into human health. And the places where we found the biggest, sort of the cleanest trail of observations and results from science was in that series of four things: the microbial metabolites, the phytochemicals, minerals and vitamins, and I'm forgetting what the third of those fourth. Oh, the omega-6 to omega-3 balance. Those are all things where the science is really solid on it in terms of making a difference. How much of a difference is what needs to be figured out now.
Understood. Thanks, Dave. And I believe we only have time for maybe just one last question here. Elizabeth asked, how can we change agricultural policy? I mean, it seems like there's so many benefits to doing regenerative farming. But it looks like their question specifically is how could they perhaps get involved? Seems to me that the U.S. government shouldn't give a penny more to agribusinesses, but should help sustain regenerative impulses.
I agree. I would love to see major league agricultural reform. I mean, the biggest lever is the Farm Bill, right? And the Farm Bill is mostly written by Congress people from, well, the aides for Congress people from states that are heavily invested in conventional agriculture. And who's advising them? People who are selling them agrochemical products for the most part. So there's some very strong and very direct economic connections to policy that have pushed us in the wrong direction. But the simple idea here is that there's a few big myths that I try to take down in Growing a Revolution about modern agriculture. Regenerative agriculture can harvest comparable amounts of food as conventional. So it's not a question of going green or starving. And that's huge, right? Because one of the first things you hear from most reporters who talk about or interview people on these issues is that, well, if we all go organic, we're going to starve. And many of these regenerative farmers are not organic farmers. There's actually room for conventional farmers to wean themselves off of agrochemicals, or not completely necessarily, if they don't want to give up those as tools for farming, because herbicides are actually useful tools for someone who wants to get rid of weeds. But the question of whether you have other ways of managing your farm so you don't need those herbicides, that's the real question. And I dove into that in Growing a Revolution in a way that hopefully would convince people that there's something there. So the I think we're ripe for some major league agricultural policy reform, but the biggest connection I would love to see is people connecting ag policy and health policy and realizing that they're basically two bits of the same overarching theme. And we've spent most of the last 100 years really emphasizing, growing enough food to feed everybody, and that's important, right? Yield is a big goal of agriculture. But I think we need to now move beyond the goal of trying to feed the world into the goal of trying to nourish the world. And when we start framing it that way, food quality comes to the fore as well. Because if you're eating a whole lot of empty calories, where does that lead you? Oh, well, the modern obesity epidemic. So there's plenty of room to really reform all this stuff. There's lots of really inspirational examples out there. When I wrote Dirt tried to make the case for societally reinvesting in soil health as an imperative, nobody was talking about soil health. Now you go to farming conferences, and that's all people are talking about. So there's been a huge shift in attitudes, and I think what we basically need to do is reframe our agricultural philosophy around soil building and building soil health, and then trying to work so that our policies work in that direction. And right now, we have our subsidies on backwards.
Yes. Unfortunately, I'm so sorry, folks. It looks like we are at time. And I would say thank you so much again, Dave, for sharing all of your vast knowledge with us today and sticking around to answer questions as well. I do want to say thank you everybody else for also joining. I will mention again that this session has been recorded, and I will be sharing those out to everybody that registered to today's talk. But yeah.
That sounds good. I'm on campus all the time. Feel free to ask me questions if you see me.
Thank you so much again. And yeah, I hope everybody has a good rest of your Wednesday. Enjoy the sun while it's still here.
Yeah. All right. Take care, everybody.